Welcome. Today we are continuing the series, the Atlas Shrugged series, looking at the psychology of the different characters in Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand's novel, obviously. And today we are going to take a very close look at the wet nurse. He's a more minor character. And before I begin, I want to turn it over to Andy.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ellen. My customary disclaimer, Atlas Shrugged is a mystery story. It may be the greatest mystery story ever written, and you don't want the ending spoiled for you. And for us discussing the novel, there's no way to discuss it meaningfully without bringing in the key characters and the events. And so there's major spoilers here. So read the book first and then watch this series. Read the book because it's the greatest novel ever written, and then watch this series because this series is epic.
Okay, and we will start, as I mentioned, with the wet nurse, and I'll give a description of him. I'll first say who he is. He is a young boy that comes from Washington to work in Reardon's mill as a spy, essentially, to make sure that Reardon follows all of the Washington directives and doesn't sell more steel than he should or sell it to the wrong people. So here's Ayn Rand's description. The young boy from Washington, whom the steel workers had nicknamed the wet nurse, hung around Reardon with a primitive, astonished curiosity, which incredibly was a form of admiration. Reardon watched him with a disgusted amusement. The boy had no inkling of any concept of morality. It had been bred out of him by his college. This had left him with an odd frankness, naive and cynical at once, like the innocence of a savage. You despise me, Mr. Reardon, he had declared once, suddenly and without resentment. That's impractical. And then he goes on. The boy looked puzzled. He had found he spoke in flat assertions. This is the boy, the wet nurse. He would say anything. He would say about just about anything about people. He's old-fashioned. He's unreconstructed. He's unadjusted. He would say it without hesitation or without explanation. He would also say, while being a graduate in metallurgy, iron smelting, I think, seems to require a high temperature. He uttered nothing but uncertain opinions about physical nature and nothing but categorical imperatives about men. So I cut that paragraph short, but I wanted just to give you an overview. And Andy, bring us into the world of the psychology of the wet nurse from his beginnings.
Right, and the wet nurse, we find out, only at the end what his name is, right? His name is Tony Valentine, and look at me. Yeah, I know. I added the last name Valentine. That's Andy. That's Andy's contribution to Atlas Shrugged in my universe, because I like the name. But Ayn Rand tells us his name is Tony. I added the last name of Valentine because I think it goes with the kid. But anyhow, he comes out of college with a degree in metallurgy, but he's working as a bureaucrat for the government. And when he first comes out of college, his job is to spy. He's a spy, on Reardon, and tell the bureaucrats and the regulators what Reardon's doing, whether he's breaking the rules or he isn't. And yet the kid has such potential. He's got such innocence about him. The college experience has been evil. It's been horrendous, but it hasn't been able to breed out of him his capacity for hero worship. He's like Cheryl in that regard. He's a hero worshiper, and the way Cheryl unknowingly hero worships Dagny, Tony the wet nurse comes to hero worship Rhea. He still has in him, Tony does, the wet nurse, this great respect for productivity, for honesty, for achievement, and he sees with his own eyes now and understands with his own brain. He's first-handed to that extent in terms of the Fountainhead, just what an extraordinary productive giant Hank Reardon is, what a hero Hank Reardon is, how his own job is a terrible one. He's shackling Reardon. They're regulating the amount of steel or Reardon metal that he can produce and trade. That he's not free to produce and trade as he should be. And Tony comes to realize that. and he stands up for Reed. And we know. I know I'm getting ahead of this, Ellen, um, but we know what happens to him. And I think Ayn Rand has this magnificent capacity to project innocence. You see it in Tony, you see it in Cheryl, you see it. We saw it in Catherine Halsey, in The Fountainhead, and this heartfelt and deeply intellectually understood nature of evil and what it does to innocence. And again, Tony's story is a cautionary tale, and it's a fictional equivalent of what Ayn Rand shows us in the Compa and it is just a stinging and ringing indictment of modern education that has weaned out of Tony almost all capacity of reason, that is to understand nature, the physical world, and has taught him how to manipulate people, how to use people, how to he's the political machinations of manipulation. That's what's practical. Reardon says at one point, what's practical depends on what it is you intend to practice, right? And if you intend to practice free and prosperous life in this world, then we need the development of the rational faculty. If what you intend to practice is the manipulation of others, the control of others, whether psychological and or political, then you need. Then you reject reason for various forms of irrationality. But Tony comes a long way, towards understanding. His capacity for rational understanding was not entirely beaten out of him in college, and he comes to understand through his own life experience. And here's where Professor Hank Reardon, is a teacher, just as Professor Dagny Taggart and Professor Francisco d'Aconia are instructors for Reardon. Well, Professor Hank Reardon is an instructor for Tony Valentine, and how to deal with metal, how to make steel, how to make Reardon metal, how to deal with physical reality, how to build, create, construct, achieve. But Ayn Rand, I think, to me, the takeaway from Tony's life and death is just how evil modern education is. And this was written in the 1950s. Well, if Ayn Rand was alive today to see the educational system. Yeah, but she shows us here, and in the Compa what modern education is, how it works, and how it not only stunts the mind, but it does so deliberately. And we'll get to we'll turn this over to Shoshana, but we'll get to the end, and what Reardon's thinking, Reardon's paternal feelings and thoughts towards Tony and towards the educational system, when we get there.
Right, Shoshana.
Okay, well, I think that what you said is right and very sad about about Tony, about this young man, that there's a kind of innocence about him in that he's so young that it wasn't as if he started out wanting to become someone who parroted irrational slogans and who wanted to hobble and have power over a man like Reardon. I mean, that's a job, and at some level, he ought to be able to figure out that that's not a good job. And lo and behold, he does. But part of what's so remarkable is that he's taught by Reardon and by demonstration rather than by argument. That's the way that Professor Hank Reardon works, is that, and this kid is still strong enough and open enough, has an active enough mind that he can use his own eyes and see that that Reardon is not a horrible exploiter. He can see that Reardon metal is a wonderful invention. He can see that Reardon produces good things and that his own job, the wet nurse's job, doesn't produce anything, that he doesn't contribute, that he takes away. He can see these things and he begins to draw the conclusions from them, which means that even with what he's been taught, it's not too late for him to use his own mind and to act accordingly. And then, of course, we see that, as we were saying with Cheryl, there are consequences for seeing clearly, and he follows those consequences and endures them. Now, one of the things that I like about the fact that, well, even the description, well, I like everything about the character, by the way. He's got just a few scenes, but they're very well used. And then, of course, there's the final scene, which is extremely powerful. But just the characterization of pointing out that he speaks in absolutes about things that aren't absolutes, and then he acts as if metal, which is an absolute, has got it seems, because within the novel, it seems is, I always try to watch it if I catch myself saying it seems, because in
I
the
do
novel,
too. I do
yeah,
too. It
yeah,
seems to
yeah,
me
well,
James
yeah,
Taggart
now,
always used that in the
right,
village.
that's the way the board of directors, that's
Yeah.
the way they talk. And of course, sometimes what one might mean by it is, I am not sure of this, but this is my impression, etc. But when it's metal, that's not your impression. The metal is what it is.
Right.
And Ayn Rand points out that initially, and I think it's Reardon noticing this, that this is Reardon, this is the way Reardon would have noticed the wet nurse talking. He's got what's absolute and what isn't absolute backwards. And
Backwards.
then, as you say, he comes to admire Hank Reardon, and he wants to help him by using his profession, of being the hobbler, of taking away some restrictions, helping him get this, helping him get that. And of course, Reardon doesn't want any favors. He just wants the chains to go away. And so part of what he learns from further interaction with Reardon is that, in fact, he can't help him. He can just stop hurting him, which in essence is what he wants to do, is to stop being the wet nurse.
Mhm.
And well, among other things, we know that as the novel goes along, you can't quit your job unless you could run away and go to the place where all the disappearers have gone. And he doesn't know about that. And Hank Reardon doesn't know about that. But what we see is that morally he improves,
Mhm.
as was the case with Cheryl. He apologizes for the way that he talked and acted before. And earlier, when we were talking about Reardon, we looked at the scene where Reardon, of course, not going to give a job to Philip, who can do nothing useful. And the wet nurse would like a job, but even is willing to settle for, you would give me a job if you could give me a job, which means that it's not just the job that he wants, but the affirmation and the understanding and the recognition that he's made progress, that he's not the man he was when he came in.
Right.
So, and I guess one more thing that I think is interesting about him is that initially you might think he's just a satirical figure.
Mhm.
And within the novel, I think that Professor Simon Pritchett is primarily a satirical figure. He says ridiculous things, we make fun of him and so on, but he's not a, he's a few lines, but he's not a full rounded character about whom we know everything. I mean, Imran describes him well and so on, but well, let's just say I don't think any of us miss spending any more time with Simon Pritchett. What happens here is that initially you could think the wet nurse is like that too. That okay, this is Simon Pritchett Jr. Okay, but because he's got some promise and Ayn Rand works on that promise, and he's got Reardon as evidence in front of him, he
Mhm.
changes. He
Mhm.
changes, he learns, because his mind's not dead. And
Right.
then of course he becomes a subplot, that there's a whole story connected with him and with his development, and of course with the culmination that we have of the wet nurse. So I
Certainly.
really like that he starts out as almost just a few lines,
Mm.
and sort of what Simon Pritchett would be if you paid attention to him, what you learn from him,
Mm.
and then it becomes much more than that.
So, and what I see, taking off from what both of you said, Hank Reardon calls him non-absolute. He's non-absolute
Mm-hmm.
right up until the end when what you were referring to, he makes the change. Reardon throughout keeps questioning him. I mean, what's a moral premise? It's something that you're going to have a lot of problems with, you know. And so, but Reardon uses the Socratic technique throughout that. Every time um, he says something, Reardon starts off kind of snarky. There are no absolutes. Go ahead and try to pour a ton of metal with no absolutes or something to that effect. And then Reardon is like coaching him along with all of his questions. And he says, why are you asking all
That's
those
so
why?
nice.
And then he laughs about, when I say he, I mean the wet nurse says to Reardon, why do you ask me all these whys, after everything I say? You just have to be more unreconstructed or whatever. And Reardon, and there's a smile there because he himself is asking a why. And you see the wet nurse's growth throughout the story. You see his growth both mentally, where he wants to know and value his mind. You see it through observation, which is what you brought out, Shoshana, that he's looking at the mills. He likes to hang around. He goes to the mills even on a holiday when he doesn't have to be there and he doesn't have any family to speak of. And he asks Reardon, do you have any family not to speak of? But he just makes an excuse to go to the mills. He has to sign some papers, it just because he loves being there. This is what he studied metallurgy, and this is what he wanted to do and should have followed at one point. So I love that Ayn Rand, with both Cheryl and all the good characters, you see the change process for the good. People grow. And of course, as readers, we all grow when we read her books. So he does find out what a moral premise is, but we haven't gotten to the end yet. So Andy,
Yeah, although I just wanted to comment that he still doesn't understand all the way,
Oh
which
no.
is why he says it isn't right, but he can't do better than that.
No, it occurred to me, we have three parents here, and the maternal or paternal feelings that we have for our children. I think Ayn Rand is showing a great deal of maternal feeling for these characters. They're like her babies, they're her children, and showing them in their innocence. It's touching and it's heartbreaking that they're exposed to this terrible evil that they can't understand, and in one form or another they're crushed by Catherine Halsey is spiritually killed. Cheryl and Tony are physically killed by the evil that they don't have the capacity to understand. Virtue is all of one piece. I think Plato made that point a long time ago, and he's right. Ayn Rand certainly agrees. And evil is all of one piece. Nevertheless, I think we could isolate aspects of it in thought. And I think Ayn Rand's showing us that Catherine Halsey, first, foremost, and always in The Fountainhead, has to be protected from altruism, from Tui's altruism. Cheryl Brooks has to be protected from nihilism, from James Taggart's nihilism. And Tony Valentine has to be protected from the educational system. I can't even say that with a straight face, but it's true. The educational system, which is supposed to nurture our minds, and Ayn Rand pointed out here, both in fiction and in nonfiction, because I think the Comprachicos is a nonfiction analog to the story of Tony in Atlas Shrugged, that here the Dewey type progressives and their heirs in the contemporary world deliberately set out to stunt the mind. I can give you 100 particulars. The most important one, is rejecting phonics to the extent they do, for some variation on the whole word method. But the deliberate attempt to stunt the mind, including in continuing into the colleges, mankind survival instrument, the whole theme of the book. Tony is so congruent here with the theme of the book, because his survival instrument has been stunted deliberately by the very institution that's supposed to nurture it. This is horrendous evil. And you got to just feel Ayn Rand's feelings here, not just the anger, the white hot anger, which is appropriate, but her love, the love for the innocent victims, wanting to protect the innocent victims. You can feel Ayn Rand's maternal love for Tony in this scene. Hank Reardon's got paternal feelings for him as he carries the dying Tony up the slakey. I choke up, I cry. You can feel the maternal feelings from the mom here, the mother of the whole story, and her love for the innocent characters, and wanting to protect them the way a mother would want to protect her children, and the way Reardon, as a father, would want to protect his child.
And the dramatic change that that Tony goes through at the end, when he just sees, he worships Hank. He wants a job from him. Hank says, anytime, as you said. But then Hank kisses him, and Tony realizes that what he loved was fighting the battle, was speaking up against the goons, against the bad guys, and wanting to warn Reardon. Fighting that battle made him feel alive in a way that working for the goons never did. Not the goons, but the bureaucratic goons. And he just, it's, as you say, Andy, it's such a paternal or maternal feeling at the end when Hank is kissing him and he dies in Hank's arms
It's
after
heartbreaking. Yeah.
trying to save Hank. And Hank is just saying, will you do one thing for me? Try to live. No, it's so sad. But
Well, the boy was taught there are no values.
yeah.
And as he says, what do you mean no values?
Mhm.
And he has values. He tried to live, he took a risk for his values. He tried to protect Hank. He wants to,
Right.
and Hank
Right.
tells him to live for his values. I think you could say he's against nihilism too. Nihilism is the threat there, that there are no values, there are no absolutes, there are no facts.
There's
And
no
yeah,
mind.
and well, everything that he's dealing with here is a fact.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So, do either of you have the quote in front of you of the mother bird plucking the feathers from the wings of a little before
yeah,
that, the wings of the
yeah,
young and pushing them out to struggle
yeah,
for their
I can.
survival? Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Actually, I've got that. Somewhere he thought there was this boy's mother who had trembled with protective concern over his groping steps while teaching him to walk, who had measured his baby formulas with a jeweler's caution, who had obeyed with a zealot's fervor the latest words of science on his diet and hygiene, protecting his unhardened body from germs, then had sent him to be turned into a tortured neurotic by the men who taught him that he had no mind and must never attempt to think. Had she fed him tainted refuse, he thought, he meaning Hank, had she mixed poison into his food, it would have been more kind and less fatal. He, Hank, thought of all the living species that train their young in the art of survival, the cats who teach their kittens to hunt, the birds who spend such strident effort on teaching their fledglings to fly. Yet man, whose tool of survival is the mind, does not merely fail to teach a child to think, but devotes the child's education to the purpose of destroying his brain, of convincing him the thought is futile and evil before he has started to think. And then it goes on for a few paragraphs into he'd been thrown to fight for existence. He had hobbled and groped through a brief doomed effort. He had screamed his indignant, bewildered protest and had perished in his first attempt to soar on his mangled wings.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Now, these are pretty big thoughts for Hank Reardon. I'm just saying that that's not the way Hank Reardon usually thinks. So, in a sense, it's as if he's learning also that there are these ideas behind everything. Now, he never bought the kind of poison he didn't that the kid did, but it's as if now he sees it too. If you hear that, that's what it means.
Mm-hmm. And I think that informed me. I read that before I brought up or in the process of when my kids were born and then bringing them up. And I always thought of that. I never wanted to poison their minds. I was very selective in what they read. And so it's another case where everything, Ayn Rand's books inform all of us and help all of us. And I was very protective of my kids' minds as much as of their food and their body. Andy, your thoughts?
No, yeah, you're right, Shoshana. For Reardon, this shows Reardon's intellectual development. First of all, Reardon didn't go to college, which is good. He studied, in the contemporary context of what schooling has too often become, especially in the humanities. But not in your classes, Shoshana. But Reardon studied metallurgy in the ore mines, right in the Masabi range in Minnesota. He's a self-made man. But then he went to school with Professor Dagny Taggart and Professor Francisco d'Anconia, and he has learned an enormous amount over the course of these few years. So now it's more believable. It wouldn't have been believable before this that Reardon would have these big thoughts, as you put it. But now, after being a very apt student for two outstanding professors, I think Ayn Rand is comfortable putting these thoughts in his mind, for us, explaining just the horrors of what the educational system. They didn't even call it educational system, the schooling. There's that line attributed to Mark Twain, but it was originally said by somebody else when he said, I never let my schooling interfere with my education. The hard nugget of truth in there is that education extends far beyond schooling, like Reardon in the ore
Like
mines.
Francisco or
Yeah,
Francisco.
Reardon in the ore mines. Reardon learning from Francisco and Dagny, mentoring, and that way education is more extensive than
I was
school.
thinking
But
of
at its best, schooling does and and should enhance our education. But the schools that Tony went to, and the schools that affect modern Western society, where they just knock out of you any attempt at objectivity and instill in you in all different varieties of subjectivism. Subjectivism is like Heinz, 57 varieties. And they stunt the mind, and they do it deliberately. And so Reardon's interior monologue as he's carrying Tony up the slag heap is brilliantly insightful, as to what has been done to Tony, and you could just feel Reardon's paternal pain. I can't read that scene without weeping. I mean, I just break out into tears. It's so touching, it's so heartfelt, and it's so goddamn true and important.
So what
And of course, now it's time for Reardon to quit too. He hasn't actually quit
After
yet,
the riot.
although he's figured everything out, and now this is the concrete illustration of everything he's figured out, except it happened to the kid.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And it's right
And
after
of course,
the riots are going on. The kids
riots
killed
are going
right
on.
as the riots begin in Hank Reardon's steel factory.
And Hank Reardon is almost killed, except for Frank Adams, right? Frank Adams saves Reardon's life. Or as I like to think, two-gun Francisco d'Anconia, who was expert at everything you want to mention. There's like nothing he hasn't mastered. He's blasting away and killing the bad guys, and and protecting Reardon's life. Otherwise, Reardon would have been killed just like Tony was.
Mm-hmm. So just in terms of the psychology, any final thoughts with the wet nurse or that you would like to say, Andy?
It's like with Cheryl.
Tony, yeah.
It's like with Cheryl and with, especially with Cheryl and with Catherine Halsey early in the story. I think Ayn Rand is such an extraordinarily talented novelist. There's some novelists and dramatists, Shakespeare, that's the level we're talking about, that make you so feel for the characters, and I feel for Tony, even the first time I read these books, I felt for them. You can see something bad is going to happen to these poor innocent kids, to Catherine Halsey at the hands of Ellsworth Toohey, to Cheryl Brooks at the hands of Jim Taggart, to Tony Valentine. You mind if I keep using my name here? I like it. Tony. No, I just need to be clear. That's not, Ayn Rand doesn't give us that name. So
that's an Andy touch.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, but you can see what's going to happen. Though something bad's going to happen to Tony because he's been crippled by the schools, and he's caught in the web of the looters, of the looters regime. And I just have very, like Ayn Rand herself, she instills in me these very protective feelings. And now when I was a teenager, I didn't have not really the feelings of a dad. I wasn't ready for that. But now I'm older, and I have a daughter. And I know what paternal feelings are like, and the desire to protect your child from harm in the world and from evil. And Ayn Rand instills in me these feelings. She's so adept, such a subtle, insightful writer. She's so adept at showing us the factual details that raise in my emotional life the feelings that she wants a rational reader to feel, protective feelings that she loves for these, the protective feelings for the characters that she loves, they're her babies, and who need protection against evil, and they don't have it. And so these are little mini tragedies.
And just when Reardon kisses him, he says, "Do you know what you just did?" I don't exactly know how to describe that, except that it's as if at some level he doesn't say, "Okay, yeah, that's fine," or "That's no big deal," but he makes it. The wet nurse makes that important, and it's also knowing that it's important to Reardon, because Reardon doesn't go. I'm quite sure Reardon doesn't go around kissing all of his employees. Or even victims, but it's as if, seeing the boy and how the boy tried to save him and seeing how things are going. He wants to give him what he can give him, and seriously. And Reardon says, yes, and I'll do it again. Now, I think I've written on this. I think something about this is like the scene with Marius and Eponine in Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And Eponine is even called Ponine, so Ponine Tony, it's similar. And the same thing with she tries to save his life and he picks her up and he kisses her and then she smiles, in death. And I think that for me, that's very poignant as far as Tony's death, is that he's dead, but he's smiling because, well, it's not good that he's dead, but as he says, is this what it's like to want something a lot and to work for it and to get it?
Yeah.
Now, that didn't happen to him before. He got to have that, and that was something better in his life, and that, like many other things, is a gift from Hank Reardon, that
Right.
it had meaning, and it had meaning even now. And so he's satisfied, and even, sticking his neck out and climbing up, just the physical activity there. These are all things to be proud of, and that he did it, and that he knows that he did it, and that he cares that he did it. And of course, as you say, Reardon is paternal. He looks and he sees how he's climbed, and he realizes what that means. It's as if, the two of them are very close, and Reardon is inside Tony's mind, and and Tony knows what things mean to Reardon, and they even sort of trade places. Who's the wet nurse now?
Right. That's a good
Yeah,
point.
Tony says, yeah, who's the wet nurse now? And of course, a wet nurse is a kind of a parent, in a place of a parent.
Right.
I don't think Ayn Rand was too literal about that, by the way, what a wet nurse actually is.
Oh,
But
I looked it up. A
yeah.
wet nurse is a
Yeah,
person.
yeah.
A nurse is another's child.
Yes.
But
yes.
So yeah, he said, my final thoughts are, he said, at the end of this, he's able to give the message to Hank that these goons, this is their plan. I wanted to get to you in time. This is the plan. They're trying to get people to attack from inside and from outside, and to make it look like you're not feeding the workers, you're starving them. And so he accomplishes what he wanted to do. He gives Hank that information, even though he's been shot by them, because they wanted by the villains, because the bureaucrats wanted to shut him up. And he's dying now. And he says, I'd like to live, Mr. Reardon. God, how I'd like to. Not because I'm dying, but because I've just discovered it tonight, what it really means, really, to be alive. And that was the point you were saying, when he stuck his neck out, and I wished I had known it sooner. And so Reardon's saying, make up your mind now to live. And he's going to get him to a doctor. Of course, he doesn't survive. But they say that, the consolation prize, or Ayn Rand talks about the consolation prize for Tony, is that he gets some incredible closure. He fights his battle. He's no longer non-absolute. He has come so far, and he is admired by Hank. And he says to Hank that after the kiss, he says he was crying, The wet nurse was crying. He goes, Mr. Reardon, I liked you very much. And Hank says, I know it. And they're smiling at one another. And it's just such a touching ending that they're able to express that. So the wet nurse.
Yeah, well, that's in Les Miserables also. Marius, I liked you very much, Mr. Marius. So it's a different scene, but it's got something of that sensibility of a death that comes with dignity and with achievement. And as you say, it's always too soon, but with the sense of having accomplished what he meant to accomplish.
Right. He gets a sense as he's dying. It isn't that everything, like Cheryl's was different. Cheryl's death was, oh my God,
I'm out of here.
It's horrible. and her last person on earth was the social worker, was Hank, was James and the social worker. And for the wet nurse, the last person on earth was being in the arms of Hank Reardon and getting kisses. And
You know, the whole story is so touching. When we touched on this, I think we could go a little further. You know,
sure.
when the wet nurse when the wet nurse comes to read him for a job, you know, and again, it's Ayn Rand's brilliant technique of the juxtaposition of opposites, where she has Philip Reardon first coming for a job. He can't do it, and Reardon says
Yeah.
you can't do it. So you're not getting the job here. But with Tony, now Tony can do it by this time, but Reardon points out they're both hobbled by the looters. They he can't legally hire him. And but the kid asks him, you give me a real job here, even if it's just a cinder sweeper. I wanna, and it always chokes me up. I want to do something productive. And Reardon says to him, I'd hire you in a second, and for a job, much more responsible than a cinder sweeper, but I can't. And and Tony has that validation now of how far he's grown. That Reardon respects him now. Reardon sees, that he could do the job the same way. Cheryl Brooks wants a better job. She could do it. Tony wants a better job. And he could do it. And so you see the kid grow. Under the tutelage of Professor Hank Reardon. He really learns about values. He's got a degree in metallurgy.
Right.
And now he really recognizes what that means. Steel production, creation of Reardon metal, production of Reardon metal, the ability to use that to build, create, construct, grow. He loves it now. Tony's alive. You know what it reminds me of a little bit, Shoshana? One of Hemingway's best stories, the Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber.
Oh,
who's a coward all his life, and then at the end he becomes this fire breather, tremendous courage before he's murdered by his wife. But I mean, for a few moments he's really alive and he's courageous. And it's not funny. It's a similarity here with Tony. It's for a few days or however long it is, until his death, he's a valuer. He's in love with steel production and Reardon metal production, and Hank Reardon as a hero worship. He has real value. So his life is short, but for several days he really lives. He really is vibrantly, passionately alive. So at least he has that much.
And
his experience makes up in depth what it lacks in length.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he also, I think we forgot to mention this part, but he really says to Hank, Mr. Reardon, they have no right to do it. Now he's the one that doesn't believe in rights. And Reardon says what? He says, take Reardon medal away from you. Mr. Reardon, don't sign the gift certificate. Don't sign it on principle. So he's getting morality with Reardon's teaching, Professor.
Yeah.
And he says,
I'm go ahead. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because he's learning about principles. He hasn't quite got it articulated, but he's going in the right direction. And I think it's interesting that earlier at the trial, when Reardon stood up, what he got from that was, well, you gave them a real beating.
I love that.
Yes. And that's good that he's on that side. On the other hand, that's not the way that Dagny would say it. Oh boy, Hank, you really beat them. I mean, and so it's as if that's part of his journey, is that he's still sort of thinking of sides, and he's picked a good side. But when he comes to saying it wasn't right, they shouldn't do it, it's wrong in principle, that's progress.
You had mentioned, Mr. Reardon, would you give me a job? It was an effort to sound normal that betrayed the days of struggle behind that question. And he says, I want to quit what I'm doing and go to work, because he doesn't consider what he's doing work. I mean, real work in steel making, like I thought I'd started out to once. I want to earn my keep. I'm tired of being a bed bug. So he's differentiating the evil people from the good people, instead of non-absolute and everything's just a chaos in a world, and people, you can't judge anybody, you can't think for yourself, and there is no absolute anyway. now he's seeing there are evil people, there are good people, and that's the theme we talked about with Cheryl, that you've brought up, Andy. You need to know how to differentiate the good from the bad.
You know, it's
Indeed.
interesting when you said it just now, that's what he wanted to do. It's as if, you know, we've got various people who've got an ambition in childhood, and then there's a question about what happens afterwards, and then some follow through on it. Because Cheryl, that's the way I felt about myself when I was young. Dagny, this is the world as she expected to see it when she was 16. Now then again, and then of course we've got the wet nurse, in that he also had something with which he started out. Ayn Rand picks up on it in Galt's speech when she has Galt say, you'll be able to awake in the morning with the spirit you had in your childhood. To hold an unchanging youth is to reach it, the end of mine is like the spirit with which one started. You know, that's a passage. And yet I think that there might be some people who even in childhood were off to a bad start, as we see from James Taggart. Just saying.
But right, by his choice. But non-absolute's a case where the education
he's got something
crushed him. It just came in and just crushed him and made everything woozy. I taught at a college counseling center once, and I think of the kids that came in. One person came in after a philosophy class on, I think it was either Kant or Hume, and was so confused. And I thought, oh my God, this is the Comprachicos. They are destroying this kid, because unless you give it in the context of a rational philosophy, unless you teach philosophy in the context of a rational philosophy, you're crushing the mind. And this kid's mind was not fully crushed because Hank Rearden, I said Ayn Rand, but Hank Rearden could bring it back and help give him a ladder to climb up the moral ladder and get some clarity with a much better moral code to the fact that he wants to change his career and work for Hank, and he knows how evil the evil people is, and he wants to warn Hank about them, and he wants to live at the end of his life. He wants to live.
Yes. Now, when you said that about the kid who came in, I thought you were going to say that he's not totally without a chance because he came to you. You know,
right, but I'm
just saying. Yeah, I mean, I know you didn't want to say that,
I only get them for a short time, but sometimes something. What Ayn Rand gave all of us. I mean, Ayn Rand was my therapist, so to speak.
Tony gains values. Tony gains values almost in the act of dying. So that's what's so heartbreaking. The living begins only just before the dying. So it's a short and passionate life for Tony.
For him, but for Hank will always carry the wet nurse within him, and what he saw was the crippling of the mind. Hank now knows from a firsthand example. He doesn't have children, but he knows it, and the opening up that mind again.
Well, this kid became Hank Rearden's son.
Yeah.
In that scene, in those very touching scenes. So you're right. You're right. Hank Rearden has a child now.
Yeah. So anyway, well, I think we can wrap it up with the wet nurse. Thank you so much, Dr. Andy Bernstein, Dr. Shoshana Milgram. I'm Dr. Ellen Kenner, and
thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Shoshana. Thanks, Ellen. As always, this was a stimulating afternoon, in Ayn Rand land.
In Ayn Rand land, I love that. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Shoshana.
Thank you.